All right, we're unpacking the developments from the latest January 6th committee hearing. Last night's primetime event centered on former President Trump and what he did and did not do during the Capitol attack. For more on this, let's bring in CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist Antjuan Seawright and CBS News political analyst and Republican strategist Leslie Sanchez. Good to see you both. Welcome to the studio,
Yes.
Antjuan. Still waiting for you, Leslie.
Yes.
Join me, Leslie.
Yes,
I'm ready.
yes.
I'm ready.
All right. So, Antjuan, we had 8 public hearings. In your view, where has the impact been? Because it strikes me that in watching last night's testimony and hearing, that the January 6th committee has been very methodical in laying out this case. And yesterday, it almost felt as if it was like the series finale. At one point, Liz Cheney said, stay tuned for September, which is like season 2. But to me, they really sort of drove home what they've been trying to convey to the American people, which is that the president of the United States, far from being an unwilling participant in what happened on that day, encouraged it, incited it. What's your takeaway?
Well, first and foremost, what we've learned from these hearings is that elections have consequences. And minus the elections and the will of the people, we would not even be hearing this information. This bipartisan committee led by Chairman Thompson and co-chair Cheney as a result of the 2020 election. So we have to give thanks to that part. Secondly, I think the most important thing we've learned from this hearing is that Donald Trump and his fellow travelers or his fellow disciples remain a present and danger to our democracy. Just because we're hearing this information, that does not mean that these people still do not exist and believe what they believe. And the fact of the matter is the former president has blood on his hands because people lost their lives as a result of January 6th. He and Marie and Vlad had the ability to stop this from happening, but he refused to do so. And as a result, the vice president of the United States was perhaps just minutes away from losing his life. That should scare the hell out of everyone watching, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. And when you have Secret Service agents calling their families as if this could be the last phone call before they meet their maker, and you have a party of Republicans who claim to be patriots, who claim that they're so pro in law enforcement, and we find all of this out, I mean, to me, it's not only hypocritical, but it's scary about what the future could be.
You know, Leslie, Antjuan said it should scare the hell out of anyone who's watching. I think that's the question, though, who's watching. The reason that they're doing these primetime hearings is because they want as many Americans as possible to watch, and a ton are. But, Leslie, are Republicans, are Trump supporters, are those people watching?
Anne-Marie, I think you raised this question early on when these hearings started, especially during prime time. And that was your question, who's going to be watching? And the numbers tell an interesting story. If people felt that there was a question, and certainly there's been a very compelling case raised, then they stayed tuned to see the compounding evidence that looks like it's leading to a result of a prosecution of our former president for numerous crimes that we've yet to hear about. If you looked at this through the lens of a political lens, then it looked like what Republicans were saying. It's a witch hunt. It's certainly cited by the Democrats. It's not bipartisan in nature in the sense that you didn't see the entire Republican conference come together and really look at this with an independent lens. And because it has never had that independence in the minds of many of this populist conservative movement, they are going to continue to discount it. And it's I've been in the field doing a lot of survey research work, and this is not what people are paying attention to. So it's a tale of two Americas. You have some that are looking at this very much to what Antjuan just said and really concerned about the threat to democracy. And you have a lot of individuals, especially within the Republican Party, who say they don't really trust the messenger. And that's where we're going to be in this hyper-politicized environment.
But Leslie, you know that the Republican Party had the option of putting other Republicans on this panel. They chose not to. We all know that. I don't know if that's the message that's coming across to people who are still supportive of Donald Trump, but this was an option. They have 2 Republicans on the panel. They could have had more. They said no.
They said no because they felt that the process wasn't fair to begin with. They felt that it was already cited and a predetermined conclusion at the beginning. And I will tell you, when that is signaled, in that tone, that it's already it's assumed conclusion, then people's ears turn off. They're not paying as much attention as they could be. They're not learning all of the facts, and you can counter that and present some of this information. Cooler minds now that we have the historical perspective on it. We can see all the different players that were involved. It makes a compelling case, but is it going to have the impact that they had hoped? No. Had they waited and held this information and really drawn this out for perhaps impeachment, which is the Republican argument, I think Republican establishment argument, people that didn't like Trump, if they had waited and compelled this together, then I think there would have been more of a groundswell of support, Republicans coming on board. But right now, it looks hyper-partisan. It's going to remain in that camp. And I think if that's politically, it will not have the impact they wanted to have.
Except one of the things that I'm curious about, Antjuan, is that Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, Liz Cheney is a bona fide Republican. I mean, if there's anybody who has those hardcore conservative credentials, it is her, going back to her father, and yet she's willing to risk it all for what she believes to be the right thing that she's doing. And I've seen Democrats calling her a patriot, and they may disagree with Liz Cheney on 98% of her policies, but on this one thing, she's willing to risk it. Kinzinger is risking it all. He frequently posts messages that he receives, threats against his family, against his baby, his newborn, that people are threatening him. Why would they do that if it was just because they're never Trumpers?
Well, you say 98%, I say 99%. I disagree with Liz Cheney on most political issues. But this is not about politics. This is literally about the future of this country. Because one or two things differently, elected officials could have died because of what happened on January 6th, and that it was a result of the language of the former president. When we were younger, we were taught that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt. Truth of the matter is, what we've learned from this hearing is that words do not matter. When I heard 187 last night on multiple occasions, if you look at the California Penal Code system, 187 means crime and the result of a murder. That's literally what happened on January 6th in the United States of America, the greatest democracy ever known to mankind. And so when Republicans make the argument that this is just politics, this is just folks in their political corners, I just fundamentally have to disagree, because here's what we do know. If the roles were reversed and there were Democrats in the hot seat, the world would be exploding as we know it. Think about the time we took spending on Hillary Clinton's emails. Almost a year of a news cycle. And here we all have Republicans do not want to wrap their arms around the truth and have no interest in having a relationship with the truth when it comes to January 6th.
And we should just point out, Anne-Marie and Antjuan and Leslie, that, and that's what the committee showed yesterday, in the days after the January 6th insurrection, many Republicans went onto the floor of the Senate and the floor of the Capitol and denounced what happened that day, from Mitch McConnell to Leader McCarthy. They all said that it was terrible. Leader McCarthy said that Donald Trump bore responsibility. So did Mitch McConnell. But just a couple of weeks later, after Kevin McCarthy made that pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago, that's when the tune changed.
Back to cuddling and playing footsie with Trump.
But that seems quite political. And, the president has been sort of making noises about that he will run, and making noises about when he's going to announce that he's going to run. I'm wondering, from your point of view, Leslie, what sort of impact could it have if the president, or if the former president announces that he's going to run again right before the midterm elections?
That would be a really bad timing, Anne-Marie, because Republicans are set to do really well in the midterm elections, and I think that takes all the oxygen out of the room. He needs to stay on the sidelines until we get through November, and then, we'll reevaluate the situation. I want to say two things. I don't think that timing would work. If the president does announce, you cannot discount the tremendous amount of support he will receive within the Republican Party. You cannot discount the tremendous amount of money that he can raise nationally. He is still a very powerful force within the party, regardless of all of these particular, hearings that have come forth. But there is political damage. There is opportunity, and there are for other Republicans to step forward in the leadership role. You're starting to hear a lot of talk about governors and attorney generals. And I mean, in the Republican circles, they're looking for alternatives. So that's the political reality. of where Trump may think he is the only game in town, but there are many others saying they don't want all of that, everything that comes along with Trump, and they want to find a new way forward for the Republican Party. But I do want to add this part. It's a party that is not lockstep with Liz Cheney. She harkens to another era. She is out of step with the Tea Party, this conservative populist movement. A lot of people say she's just a bygone time, and that's why they're not very favorable to her either.
That is so fascinating. Antjuan, what do you want to say?
You know, Donald Trump would be literally a gift for the Democrats. He will be a political weapon of mass destruction and distraction. I think he will be a tremendous liability for the Republican Party going forward, regardless of whether he announces today or whether he announces in 2024. The truth of the matter is you will find Republican candidates running full steam backward away from him because of the liabilities that have come as a result of Donald Trump. And I don't think you can ignore the realities that the personality and the policies that came as a result of Trump and the way the tectonic political plates shifted because of him in this country.
Well, the hearings are over for now, but as we heard, there's going to be more coming in September. Hopefully, we'll have you guys on again. Antjuan and Leslie, thank you so much.
Thank you.